Now, it says a lot about William that his URL for his website is actually not williamarpolz.com, but it's Dishboy Dreaming. So this is, I think we're going to get, there's clearly some of the interesting humour and entertainment is very much in his work. He's come from a very much a distinctly figurative tradition and draws extensively on art history for his subject matter and form. He's exhibited his work since 1998 and in 2005 won the Helen Emperor National Outdoor Sculpture Award. Hume is very much central to his work, and while he has an interest in certainly Baroque sculpture, I'm also interested in the fact that he uses the life model in his works, and perhaps wanted to ask this, there are several works here by him, but this is this group work here at the Order of Terpsichore by the Muse of Dance, to ask William how he integrates both his interest in historical work that you draw on, but also the life model and life drawing, because working from life and working with the figure and sculpture is something very difficult to do now, sort of thing. So much later.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, this work, which, as Christopher said, was taken from working with a life model. I don't view life models as just a piece of meat, which some artists just use them as an object, much as they would a piece of still life, but it's a living piece of still life. I really am inspired by the interactions with the models that I work with. And this work was inspired by a dancer who was in So You Think You Can Dance in the first series, a dancer called Reese Bobridge, who was a beautiful dancer, beautiful sort of specimen, and also I had a lot in common with him because a dancer devotes their life to their art as well. They unfortunately have a much more limited lifespan in their art form than I am lucky enough to have achieved. But Reese would come to my studio. I mean, I just sort of actually met him at a funeral of a friend of mine who was a mutual friend, and I said, we should do a work together. And so he came and was able to hold this extraordinary pose, and that's what sort of inspired me. And the sculpture is called At the Altar of Terpsichore. Terpsichore is the muse of dance, most famously played by Olivia Newton-John in Xanadu. And so there is three cherubic figures laying garlands at the, a tribute to the art and spirit of dance. They're made, modelled in clay in a very traditional way that I learnt in art school when I went to art school in the 80s. Metal armature, lots of wooden butterfly supports, the clay, and then modelling it all. I made moulds from it, and then was able to adapt and add things because they're cast in polymer cement, which is a contemporary material. So they've got a metal armature inside, and then I was able to add all of these pieces on and twist the figure and shape it into the way. So while, I am a traditional sculptor, I also really try to push the materials with my concept to sort of, make them fly and be weightless and lyrical, and the sort of whiplashes of garlands, all of which are, hand modelled and little moulds all stuck together, and Yeah, so that's a kind of an overview of the way I try to work with things. This is a lot of people think they might be ceramic because they allude to that kind of Celadon ceramic material, but in fact they're totally synthetic and yet can go outdoors. They're totally sort of weatherproof, sort of this non-toxic polymer cement with a UV coat over the top of it. So yeah, I mean, you know, and it plays with that idea of being sort of sensual, playful, very cheeky, erotic, gorgeous thing, which I try to get inside out. Thank you.
Thank you. Dean's born in Maryborough and then studied RMIT and Monash here in Victoria and has had solo shows since '83. In addition to sculpture, which we see several examples here, and also some that are kind of life-size, so big public sculpture, Dean's works in a range of media, works in painting, printmaking and drawing as well. So it's a very sort of approach to, a very full-rounded approach to art making. His works represented in collections of the National Gallery of Australia and many state and regional galleries. So rather than perhaps talking about the making and the casting, I'd really like perhaps if you might talk to us about how your work in, and assuming there are relationships between the work, there are certainly visual relationships, but perhaps conceptual relationships that happen in working from making paintings, perhaps printmaking, drawing, and also in your sculpture.
Well, as a young person, I was very interested in printmaking and studied printmaking at RMIT. And I guess became quite obsessed with etching first and then later lithography. And some of my mentors kept saying, you know, don't forget about painting, don't forget about sculpture. But I was quite involved in the graphic arts and, you know, appreciated sculpture, visiting museums in Europe and then going to Egypt and, you know, really looking at sculpture and loving sculpture as well, but never really making sculpture. And around 1990, when I was working in France, I was working with a printer called Frank Borders in Paris, who printed for Dall'Ava and other modern masters. And between grading stones, I read a lot about Dall'Ava, who I was fascinated with, and also about Giacometti, and started to think more and more about creativity and sculpture. And I thought to really develop as a creative artist, I really started to have to think more seriously about sculpture and making sculpture and how one idea in painting or printmaking could evolve into another technique and evolve into sculpture. And Dall'Ava's theories about creativity and outsider artists and naive artists and untrained artists was very attractive to me. And I loved his philosophy of art making and gradually became more and more interested in sculpture. And I found that by diversifying into 3D work and sculpture, an idea could start, say, as a painting and then develop as a lithograph, and then a small sculpture and then a larger sculpture. And I really found that flexibility really helped my creativity. So a tiny drawing could become a massive sculpture, or a massive sculpture could become a tiny etching. And when I had exhibitions of 2D and 3D together, I found it very interesting how the same idea could translate into a different technique. And seeing the different works together in the one exhibition was very interesting. Also in Paris in 1993, I saw an exhibition, a retrospective of Giacommetti's work. And I guess for me the penny really dropped at that stage, seeing how he'd have an idea in painting a portrait, say, of his brother, which would develop into a sculpture of Diego. And it just kind of rounded everything out nicely. And that was one of the big magnets that attracted me to sculpture. Also, learning about Dall'Ava's work in sculpture, he used to go down to the market in Rue Mouffetard, and there was a man selling sponges, and the ugly sponges were discarded, and they were the ones that Dall'Ava wanted, and he made sculptures out of the ugly sponges. So yeah, I was very attracted to that flexibility of creativity with found objects. I started making found objects at first. Started collecting found objects, and made sculptures here out of plant material and discarded rubbish of all kinds, and then gradually got the courage up to go to the foundry and make small sculptures that were initially based on some of my etchings. And someone described the sculptures as being like crushed beer cans because they're very flat. And the silhouette is very important in my work because I'm used to working in a 2D way. So the prints kind of stood up and became sculptures, and gradually over years they've evolved and become fatter. Yeah, the silhouette is still a very important part of my sculpture practice.
Interesting, that's great. Thank you. Thank you. And I'll introduce Gus Dall'Ava, who's also trained at RMIT in Monash and has exhibited his work extensively since 1975. Interesting from my point of view, his work was in the Sculptural Trail of 1978, which as a first year art history student we all trundled up to from Adelaide, so did that. He's also exhibited his work quite a lot with Geoffrey Bartlett, who's also of course in the show. His work's included in the state and national collections, and he works very much, a lot of the works in series or series of works, and also within the kind of individual work there are very interesting dialogues that happen between the shapes and forms within them, which makes it really very almost hermetic, almost as if the work itself is contained, but it's a dialogue of conversation forms. So, and for us, and as a viewer, I think that's the interesting part, is working out the interesting internal relationships between the forms, a bit probably in the same way that you might respond to working out how paintings are constructed. And so I'm interested to perhaps talk about your approach in creating the forms and how you place them together, and perhaps the different selection of materials. Perhaps if we talk about this work over here, running over.
Right, running water. I made that work at the height of the drought here in Victoria, and I just thought I'd try and do something to represent the period of time we're in. So most of the elements I've used in it obviously relate back to water, like the cloud, sort of an optimistic clouds that's black because it's going to rain, the water come down. So I've used a blue base to emphasise water, and the stainless steel zigzag shape is meant to be like cascade, like waterfall cascade. So all the elements in there relate back to nature in some way. The relationship between the forms is obviously quite important. There's quite a lot of emphasis on balance and very precarious balance of things, which translates into a lot of my other work as well. It's very much about life and balancing things, and just the relationship between different elements. About that work, I think there's much else I can say. The materials that I use, I like to push the materials to their limit. Some of the marble would normally not be used in such fine, delicate.
Yeah, because they cut very fine, aren't they?
Yeah, they come down. It's very hard to hold a very sharp edge on the marble because it tends to fray. But so I tend to try and push the material as much as possible as well.
Now, Jan's works in this show here gives us some clues as to what they are, but visually they are kind of vessels here on wheels. That's literally as the image is. One is called Untitled, and the other is Swamp Carrier, so it has some kind of indication into this of what they might be about. What I thought, looking at these works, which are constructed of metal and sort of some found materials that you've ingeniously fabricated, and in this case kind of knotted and woven together, is what attracts you to this this particular type of form of, essentially, it could be a canoe, it could be a cradle, or whatever type of form it is on wheels, and what it is that attracts you to that and in your work that you're interested in following up.
Well, when I came in here, I thought I'd just been as anonymous and
no such luck.
With my work, I always find it very environmental. I've walked through the desert a lot, and these vessels, if you like, really has been. I've been through the desert a few times, and a few years ago, and recently this year. And when you're walking through the Simpson Desert, you think it has been a sea at one time, and so walking through there, and it's a beautiful desert, and that's when I thought, I like kayaking, so I like on the water as well. So it's a combination of looking at deserts and looking at water, what has been and what is now, and how the environment is moving towards another desert. So this was the idea of having vessels in deserts, and because there's not much water, I put wheels on it. So fairly basic, really. And the materials, really, those twigs comes from, which I've been using for many years up in Dall'Ava, and we're about to go and collect a whole lot of other. It's a tea tree, very strong, very hard, and very malleable. And so I've been using it for years. So it's very nice.
And then the string or the twine, is this a...
It's just a twine. Yes. You can buy it in your shop.
Yeah.
Too easy.
Good.
Yes.
Good. Well, thank you. Thank you. Susan Raitt, who's got the smallest work in the exhibition, very preciously protected perspex here. Susan, born in the UK and trained at the Brighton Polytechnic and then at the RCA in London, but we're pleased, right behind me. So pleased to call you one of our own, since you've been living and working in Australia for a very long time now. It's been trained as a jeweller, and then of course obviously exposed to Netsuke and other very fine Japanese carving traditions that led Sue to really explore this form and essentially make it her own. It's what she's very much known for. I suppose, and she's really, I suppose, since then, I mean, the work of yours that I've seen has really not looked back from making these very small, exquisitely finely carved objects is the main thing. So how does it always, what's it feel like always to have the smallest work in it?
Well, I think, hello everybody, it's lovely to meet you. I'm very happy to always have the small work. I think I was told good things come in small packages, and certainly some of the most potent things do. Anyone who's had a small dram of single malt scotch will know that, so consider it the single malt scotch of the exhibition.
But the serious question I really want to ask you is because you've got, this is a Japanese tradition, you're English-born, so you've come to this as you've sort of essentially, you could say, appropriated, adopted this tradition, made it your own. Two things that interest me is how your approach is different to it because you're not coming to it within the tradition, you're obviously now very knowledgeable and work with it, but you came as an outsider to it. How that makes your work a bit different, and also perhaps you might also comment on the contemporary tradition of Netsuke making in Japan by Japanese artists, if you're freer because you don't have that tradition behind you.
Yes. Well, when I first encountered Netsuke, it was at the Victorian Albert Museum in the Japanese collection. And when I encountered it, there was a case full of these tiny little carvings. And I looked at them and saw that they were very small, but they were so potent, they were redolent with meaning. And I went back to college to make my first Netsuke. But I thought, well, this is not my tradition. this is a Japanese tradition, so it seemed to me that it would be cultural piracy if I tried to make Netscape as such. And I was making small carvings influenced by Netscape. But I kept being asked to make Netscape by collectors. And in 1988, I received my first letter from a Japanese dealer asking me to exhibit in Japan. And I wrote and said to him, this was a great compliment, and I was very flattered because I had been very nervous about offering my work in Japan to a Japanese audience and calling it Netscape. And he said, don't be nervous, it's the highest compliment you can pay because a Netscape apprenticeship is 10 years. And so they said, you have spent 10 years of your life, well, it wasn't strictly true, acquiring this skill. And so I started exhibiting in Japan and was fortunate to be collected in Japan. And when I first met the Japanese carvers, I was intrigued to learn from them, and they were learning from me about the different techniques and the different approaches. And it seemed to me that the Japanese are working as an apprenticeship. They are concentrating on technique a great deal and on tools. The culture, the myths and the legends, they grow up with. It's part of their essential being. And they spoke to me and said they are very pleased that a Westerner and a woman, because most of them, let's face it, are male. And so I have the interesting experience of being accorded honorary male status when I visit the Japanese carvers. They thought it was wonderful because I was forming a bridge to a Western market, taking Netscape to a wider audience, and they could then come over that bridge too. But they said, it makes sense to us that you don't use Japanese imagery. You don't use their legends and their iconography. And that seems appropriate for me too. That would be cultural piracy. I mean, I'm appropriating the form, but then I'm wanting to do something Western, make a Western addition to that form. So I'm working in quite a Japanese way in that I'm using my own cultural background. I'm looking at my literature, I'm looking at life around me, I'm making social comment in much the way that the Japanese carvers always did and still do. But I'm doing it from a Western standpoint. So this piece, for example, is an illustration of a poem by Ted Hughes that I particularly responded to and loved, and felt that a lotus is quite an appropriate subject for an exhibition called The Object Divine. So, that's why I've selected it for this show. As far as the Japanese carvers are concerned, they have a bit of a crisis at the moment because ivory, CITES, I've never used it. I've always preferred wood, but the Japanese carvers, their favoured material is ivory, and with the CITES ban, appropriately, they can't use ivory. So they have, over the last 10, 15 years, been exploring other materials and are moving more into wood. So that's been quite a challenge for them as a different way of working. But they are still, in a way, they are still working in a traditional form, and they're working with a traditional mindset. I think Western carvers tend to be much freer in their ideas and their interpretation of ideas, don't necessarily have the background in skill, and that takes a long time to acquire. So I think that the Western work and the Japanese work actually complement one another quite well, and there's quite a fair bit of crossover.
Thank you. That's very good.
Thank you very much.
Geoffrey Barton's also born in Melbourne and studied at RMIT and began exhibiting his work in solo and group shows since the mid-1970s. He's also represented, his work's represented widely in collections, the National Galleries, the Art Gallery of New South Wales, and of course many more. And he's also worked for many public commissions, so you'll all be very obviously familiar with his work, particularly in Melbourne. Jeff, you've referred to the sort of the love of making things, the actual mechanics of the making of the object. And in the work Bird in Flight, could you tell us about the creation of this work? Do you actually work sort of more intuitively from the materials, or much more conceptually from the creation of it. And the work we're talking about is a Bird in Flight, which is the sculpture down near the doorway there.
No. I suppose materiality of the work has an impact on the aesthetic. Material's an interesting thing, I think, for a sculptor, because clearly everything we do, for the most part, is revolving around the materials that we choose to approach our aesthetic, and we find quite often it's a bit of a struggle that the materiality doesn't dominate the aesthetic. There's a sort of struggle between that and the aesthetic, and we have to be careful of the fact that it can impinge on the soul and the spirit of the work. And but it's a delicate balance, because material can give you an introduction into the aesthetic, and give you a sort of a key to the door. So I've always found it an interesting aspect of my working process. Sometimes when I think I've got too close to, or let's say I've got to know the material too well, let's say I've got too good at it in a sense, and I feel as a result it may start to do, as I was saying before, impinge on the aesthetic, then I'll move on, change material, and move to something else, so that I can regain the ascendancy of the aesthetic.
So then you come back again after.
Sometimes I do, yeah. I think all artists do that. They sort of keep returning to old themes or to unresolved issues that they worked on before, and that may be the material, or may be something that's more related to the subject of the work.
Oh, thank you. So what I suggest is we perhaps might, after we've sort of spoken, go down and look more carefully at Jeff's work down there, and also at the far end of the gallery space. We've just had six of the artists here represented today talking about their work. I've been kind of leading questions, but there may be questions that you might like to put to any of them, or they to one another, or to me, or to Lauraine, to keep this as informal as possible. Or have we covered all in the varied answers, which have been very interesting, because we've learned a lot about the different types of practice, different types of materials by artists and sculptors who make incredibly different types of works. We've got kind of very different responses. Has it kind of given you enough to look at the moment, or is there anything? Because what we might do then is, if you'd like to, I think, wander around. You've sort of met the artists, so those of you who know them, you might like to talk to them privately, and also to one another, and enjoy this really wonderful exhibition. Thank you.
Finally, I'd just like to thank Christopher for running this discussion, and I really would like to thank each of the artists who have exhibited in the exhibition and have come and participated today. I learned a lot more, which is wonderful. I like learning, and I like learning out of the exhibitions. And I hope that please feel free to engage with the artists. I'm sure that they will answer any questions. And finally, can I say, don't be scared of sculpture. It's wonderful. Buy it. Buy it like you buy a painting. It's a wonderful thing to have in your home. So, thank you. And Christopher, here's a small thank you for being such a great...